From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
We're talking taxes today. Joe Biden and Donald Trump have many differences on policy, but one of the biggest is taxes. And the consequences are enormous because whoever wins will have to work with Congress to rewrite the tax code after the bulk of the Trump individual tax cuts that passed in 2017 expire at the end of 2025. So what are the differences between the two candidates on taxes, and what does it mean for the tax rewrite that's coming in 2025? Welcome. I'm Paul Gigot, editorial page editor of the Wall Street Journal, and I'm here with my colleagues, tax aficionados, Alicia Finley and Kate Batchelder-Odell. All right, let's start by looking at what the two candidates are saying about taxes. First, let's look at Joe Biden's big tax increase proposal. He laid it out, his policies for a new term, presumably in his budget, the last budget, where he promised what can only be called a huge tax increase, by some lights as much as $5 trillion over 10 years. A couple of highlights or lowlights, as the case might be: raising the top individual marginal rate to 39.6 from 37, the corporate rate from 21% to 28%. The Tax Foundation says this would put the U.S. corporate rate along with the average tax rate, if you include that, up to 32.2%, which is the second highest in the world, would be after that paragon of tax efficiency, Colombia. They also wants to raise the corporate minimum book tax to 21 from 15. Dividend and capital gains rate would be taxed at regular income tax rates above $1 million in earnings. And here's a sleeper. He'd raise the Medicare payroll tax to 2.1% from 0.9%. This is on every dollar of earned income. No income cap, so it's essentially raising the top marginal tax rate, if you include the other increases, to 41.7% with Biden's other changes. So there are many more, and we can go through some of those. But Alicia, what does this all add up to in your view?
Well, probably the biggest tax increase in history if you were to actually get it through Congress. You mentioned some of the, as you said, highlights of the plan, including the tax increases that will come when the GOP tax reforms expire in 2025. I've seen anywhere estimates between $5 trillion and $7 trillion in revenue. Now, I don't think they'll actually raise that much revenue because of the actual effects on incentives and behavior. I mean, historically, the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, has actually overestimated the revenues that are raised by tax increases, and they generally have been much less. And that's because of the incentives to either shield income, especially at the higher end. Corporations and businesses will take advantage of deductions. In terms of capital gains, maybe there are people who just won't actually realize those capital gains as much when the rate increases. So for various reasons, while the headline rates would represent the biggest tax increase in history, I just don't think that they'll raise anywhere as much revenue as they're projected, and nowhere near as much as they would need to fund their welfare state expansions.
And that's not all, folks. Kate, Democrats in the Senate and the House are not potted plants, and they want to get their say here. And we're already finding, listening to what some of the Democrats are saying, that they're not going to sit by when this tax cuts expire. They have their own ideas, and Ron Wyden has a big wealth tax proposal, for example. And Elizabeth Warren, as recently as last week, has laid out her plans to raise many more taxes. Tell us about it.
Well, right. So you have Democrats out there saying, I believe Mark Warner used the phrase tax Armageddon to describe what's coming in 2025. It's hard to believe that this phrase made it out of the focus group. But it did, and this is how they're describing their own ambitions to realize what Alicia described as one of the largest tax increases in history. The wealth tax is, of course, getting a lot more attention now that there was a ruling from the Supreme Court last week that may have somewhat opened the door to the constitutionality of wealth taxes. It's long been thought that wealth taxes are not constitutional, which I think is true, but I also think they're highly unworkable. I mean, wealthy people do not keep their assets stored under the mattress in cash, how you value artwork and all these other difficult questions. I mean, wealth taxes are just a compliance nightmare.
But that will not stop them, Kate.
No, it will not stop them. It will have the effect that Alicia's describing, which it won't raise very much money. But I mean, one element that we haven't talked about here is what a drag all of this is going to be on growth. And that's the real problem, growth in wages and better prospects for Americans. I mean, higher corporate tax rates, that higher payroll tax you mentioned is a tax on wages. I mean, these are a recipe for diminished prospects for the American public. And I think it is important to start thinking about that being on the ballot in the fall as Democrats are talking about Armageddon.
Kate, you haven't got the memo that taxes don't matter. Tax rates don't matter. They are irrelevant to behavior and to growth. There are some of the new right sages tell us as they push for higher taxes. Of course, it's nonsense. But Alicia, there's an element, a twist here politically from the Democrats in the Senate regarding the middle-class tax cut that are going to expire too. That not just the rates on top rates of income, but the rates on middle and working class people that expire as well as some of the other raise in the standard deduction, for example. Most of those things expire as well. And what did Elizabeth Warren say about those?
Well, she basically said that we should take the middle class hostage, in that we should not extend those tax cuts unless Republicans agree to raise taxes on the so-called wealthy and corporations. So it's not enough just to raise the rates back to 39, what it was before the GOP tax cuts in 2017. So raise the top rate back to 39.6%, or raise the corporate rate. They basically want to go even further. And I don't think Elizabeth Warren is even content with a 28% corporate rate. I think she wants to go back to 35%. And she's also called, and we were talking about a wealth tax, a 2% wealth tax on net household income over $50 million and a 3% over $1.
That's on all assets.
That's on all assets. That's not even capital gains unrealized. That's just on the assets themselves.
So if you own that Van Gogh painting, you're going to pay taxes on that if you can somehow figure out if it had increased in valuation.
Right. Regardless if it had increase in valuation, you have to owe a tax. It's basically a property tax, or at least under her proposal. But again, to Kate's point, it won't raise nearly as much revenue as they're hoping. I'll be curious to see how IRS goes about assessing those Van Gogh paintings.
With all of the art experts that they have at the IRS. All right, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk about Trump's proposals and some of the Republicans and what we're hearing from them when we come back. Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot here on our Potomac Watch, a podcast with Alicia Finley and Kate Batchelder-Odell. All right, let's turn to Donald Trump and what he's been saying about taxes. Of course, he says he would like to extend the 2017 tax cuts and maybe reduce some taxes further, though he hasn't been very specific. He's tossed out the possibility of cutting the corporate rate from 21 down to 20, but without any specific proposal or legislative or laying it out in any document. One specific proposal he's mentioned is he doesn't want to tax tipped income. That's waiters and hotel maids and other people who get tips, pay taxes on those tips, of course, if they're reported. If they're in cash, I don't think a lot of those are reported, but in any event, some people think that would be $150 billion in tax cuts in additional lost revenue over 10 years. I think that's a highly speculative estimate. But in any way, Kate, what do you make of Trump's tax proposals and his tax instincts?
Well, from a 30,000-foot point of view, you have to give him some credit for at least moving in the right direction and on some things, on going down maybe a little bit further on the corporate tax rate, not up. The tariffs, obviously, that he's floated are in the opposite direction and just amount into a tax increase. But I think the tips proposal is really unfortunate, and he's repeating it quite often on the campaign trail and trying to start this movement where if you go to a restaurant, you write on your receipt, vote Trump because there will be no taxes on tips. Again, in the at least category, this could encourage more work among some service workers by obviously giving them a huge tax break on a huge part of their income. But at the same time, it really is just a hoary tax carve out for one constituency that, same as the other tax increases we've been talking about, when you change people's tax rates, they change their behavior. So here we might see entirely new categories of tipped workers. When the tree removal guy comes to your house, you might have to figure out how much to tip him, and that might start to make a lot of his wages. But also, it erodes the tax base, which is the opposite of what Trump's tax reform tried to do by broadening the base and lowering the rates, and thereby, that's on the corporate rate, particularly good for growth. This is just opposite that instinct. And that's why I think it's really unfortunate. It really is just a kind of a vote buying exercise, which may have some more merit than writing off student loans, but in the end is not going to create the kind of rising incomes, which is supposed to be part of your guiding star in tax policy, and also just raising revenue for the government with the least amount of economic damage. So on that score, I think it's a loser.
I think that's called tax policy for Las Vegas. And Reno, Nevada is very much in play this year, and Trump is making a play for the many service workers who rely on tipped incomes at all those hotels, the casinos, restaurants in there and in other resort areas. But Nevada seems to be target number one. That's where Trump unveiled it. But let's dig into sort of the other tax policy developments, Alicia, for the Republicans, because when Trump came in 2016, he offered a tax policy, very general. But really what happened is he went to adopt the framework that Paul Ryan and various House Ways and Means Committee chairmen had developed in Republican circles over the years. Kind of ready-made template. There it was. There's no such Republican template on Capitol Hill now. Republicans on Capitol Hill are floundering around trying to figure out how in the world they can actually extend the tax cuts. They don't know how to do it. They don't have even a majority right now that could support a single proposal. Republicans are now saying, oh, well, I don't like that corporate rate of 21%. We got to go higher because we want to fund middle-class tax cuts, such as the child care tax credit expansion and so on. One problem, that child care tax credit extension would be about, $1 trillion or so in costs over 10 years, and that's probably an underestimate. So how confused are the Republicans here?
I think it's going to be a problem. For one, we haven't talked about the ACA subsidies. These were enhanced during the Inflation Reduction Act and actually previously.
These are Obamacare.
These are Obamacare, right? The Affordable Care Act subsidies. And those also lapse in 2025. So there's going to be some horse trading, but these have very much benefited the middle class and a lot of people, and especially seniors. So I think there's actually going to be support among some Republicans for extending those, as well as the state and local tax deduction, lifting that to, there are already some Republicans calling to lift it to $20,000 for married couples from $10,000. You mentioned the child tax credit. Maybe it won't get increased back up to $3,600, which was the level from American Rescue Plan, the March 2021 COVID bill. But you could potentially see there is a tax bill that would make more of it refundable, and so which reduces the incentive to work. And so I think there's a very large segment of the Republican Party. I mean, you mentioned Marco Rubio, that believes that the government should be doing more to help the working class and basically doing what Democrats do by turning the tax code more into transfer payments to favor their constituencies.
Just to elaborate on the SALT deduction, the state and local tax deduction, that's currently $10,000 maximum. Republicans in high tax states like New York, New Jersey, and California have really laid down the law and said, we're not going to vote for anything unless you raise that threshold. Kate, I've talked to one Republican who mentioned to me privately from New York State that if it were raised to $50,000, he would be able to win re-election for the rest of his life in New York. And $20,000, I don't know if they settle for just that. The problem with that is that also costs a heck of a lot of money. And then there's the child care tax credit. And if Donald Trump puts Marco Rubio on the ticket, some say, as VP, you'll get a lot of lobbying for the big expansion in the child tax credit.
Yes. Well, on the SALT point, I mean, as predictable as it is that the guiding principle is getting reelected in perpetuity, I do think that, if anything, Trump needs to go in the opposite direction because, again, he needs things that bring in revenue to pay for other important, far more pro-growth tax cuts. And if anything, calling the state and local tax deduction a marriage penalty, I mean, married couples do not pay two sets of property taxes, even if they pay two sets of income taxes. So I think that's a little bit misleading when we talk about ways in which the tax code discourage people from getting married. I don't think that is really what's going on in the state and local tax deduction, which is only paid by people who itemize. The question is for Trump is whether he has the real mettle to defy some of these special interest groups that all are clamoring for this or that, and then prioritize instead improving the code, raising more revenue with lifting incomes. But the SALT deduction is going to be a crucial test of that because it was a huge financer of the 2017 tax cuts. And also, if you raise it to $50,000, you've basically defeated the purpose of trying to cap it in the first place. And again, to remember the basic economics of this deduction, I mean, what this is it gooses blue states' ability to hit their citizens with high taxes because it makes those who pay those high tax rates feel less pain of them. So the goal has also been to encourage some of these blue states to address their underlying tax burdens. And so I see no reason why Republicans should go in the opposite direction now, but you're right that there's likely a huge movement to do that, and it'll be politically hard to get a bill through without doing that.